Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another week, another episode of my show. I'm Jordan, and this is Taking a Different Perspective, where I talk, discuss, review, and analyze all things film and media. And so going ahead and jumping right into today's episode, I thought that I would start out the episode by, saying some statements that I've seen. He's not the first black superhero. He's not the first black superhero to have a movie. He's just a superhero. It's just a movie. I don't get the hype. The revolution won't happen because of it. These comments, along with others that carry similar sentiments that I have had the displeasure of seeing float down my timeline on more than one occasion, are pretty disheartening to say the least. If you were to search Black Panther and just a movie on Twitter, you would see dozens of tweets from people within the community, all right, that are adamant about raining on people's parade and ruining the fun for everybody. And so besides that, looking at the bigger picture, what I see are dozens of people that don't truly understand the social, historical, and even cultural significance of not only this character, but this movie and superheroes in general. And so I know that, maybe hearing that last part may be a bit shocking to some of you because, well, if you've been watching this show for a while, then you would know just how it is that I feel about superheroes, more specifically this superhero era that the movie industry is currently drowning in. But no, besides that, besides those tweets serving as inspiration behind today's episode, I personally wanted to get a better understanding of superheroes. And so one of the ways that I thought that I could do that is by looking at superheroes and their relationship with society and why it is that they are so popular and important. And so one of the things that I kind of already knew going into this episode, but wanted to explore more, was this idea that superheroes provide this kind of mirror image of society in which of the society in which they were created or popularized in. And so by understanding a specific superhero, you can have a better understanding of society. And so before I get into this statement of why it is that Black Panther isn't just a movie, I thought that I would first explore superheroes and the relationship with society. And so for anyone out there that doesn't know, comic books, the different time periods for comic books are divided up into 4 different ages. The first age being the golden age of comics, which started in 1938 and lasted till around 1950. Now, of course, this includes post-World War I era, the Great Depression, World War II era, and then it ended with the beginning of the atomic era. Now, comic books at this time had this kind of superhero archetype where it was all about creating a nearly mythological superhero who could integrate into society, where the stories themselves are based within the real world. And so some of the big themes with these comic books at this time, it centered around assimilation and conformity. And so know that at this time with America, it was characterized by this idea that's known as nativism, or fear of foreigners. In the early 20th century, this is when America saw one of the biggest influxes of immigrants from Southern and Eastern European nations. And so, of course, the people that were already living here saw all of these immigrants coming in, and they didn't like it, right? They thought that it was going to change the traditional way of life and that it was going to change the overall image of America. So, it would kind of make sense that themes like assimilation and conformity would be themes within comic books, because they were themes in America during this time. And so some of the superheroes that we were introduced to are superheroes that we still know and love today. So those characters being, Superman, Wonder Woman, Batman, Captain America, and Captain Marvel. Now, going ahead and moving a little bit further into the time period after the Japan atomic bombings, this is when we started to see superheroes with radiation gain powers, and superheroes that were fighting Nazis and Japan's soldiers. So think someone like Captain America. It was also during the wartime that comic book sales were at their highest, or at the very least, they were increasing to the max. And a big reason as to why this is because you had stories within these comic books that were reflecting actual events that were happening in the war effort. And so, it basically allowed for kids to have this kind of vicarious participation in the war, because of course, they couldn't be out there on the battle lines with their fathers or brothers or whomever. But what we saw is that after the wars, when comic book sales started to decline, and so this ended up leading to the a more kind of diversification of the kind of stories that were being told within comics. And so this then gives way to the Silver Age of comics, which which lasted from 1956 to around the 1970s. And so this is when Marvel and Stan Lee becomes really popular. This is when we start to see stories that center around something other than superheroes going out and, and trying to fix the world. So things like horror, romance, and crime become really big. And so one of the biggest consequences that happen as a result of this kind of shift in the kind of stories that are being told in these comic books is that it led to the creation of this organization called the Comics Code of Authority, where their job was basically to regulate, monitor, and control violent or questionable content within comics. And so what we start to see a lot of comic books doing is they're choosing to reintroduce characters that the public had already seen. So people like the Flash, the Green Lantern, and Justice League, we start to see them being reintroduced in these comics at this time, because it was basically a safe bet to kind of go back to this kind of traditional way of telling stories, instead of, kind of putting yourself out there and taking a risk by, maybe doing a story that the Comics Code of Authority isn't going to, that they're not going to like. But what we see, some of these publishers doing, these comic book publishers, Marvel in particular, is that they're saying, hey, we hear that the Comics Code of Authority is a thing. We see the different guidelines that you guys have out there, and we know the consequences that can happen because of it. But they were like, while we know all of that to be true, we're still going to go ahead and do what we want to do. And so that's actually, one of the things that ended up leading to the eventual revision and then abandonment of the code. And so what we start to see with superheroes and the comic books of this time is that the superheroes are starting to become actual humans that deal with real life human problems, failures, and mistakes, and all that kind of things. And so this is when we get the introduction of characters like Spider-Man, the Fantastic Four, the Hulk, X-Men, and even Black Panther, as a way to kind of mirror the rise of youth culture and the social unrest that was rampant during this time in the 60s. And so what I've seen people say that kind of led to the end of the Silver Age and what gave way to what is known as the Bronze Age is the death of Gwen Stacy, because never before in a comic had a significant character been killed and in the violent way that she was. And so, like I said, this led to a more kind of grittier and violent style that is known as the Bronze Age, which lasted from around the 1970s to around 1985. And so this is when we get storylines that are a lot more darker. They deal with even more real world issues. So things like drugs, violence, alcoholism are a thing. And so remember that at this time in the 70s, you can kind of look at that as being like a continuation of the fight that was going on in the 60s. So, you have the women's rights movement, you have the conservative pushback that sprang up as a result of all the, social progressive change that happened in the 60s. You also have things like Watergate and the Vietnam War, that kind of leads to this shift in the American way of life, where instead of this kind of optimism that characterized the 60s, what we now see is this kind of pessimism, skepticism, and not really believing in the institution of America as being this great country that cared about its citizens. And so it was actually this shift, like I said, that was kind of a turning point in American ideology and American culture, and it's still something that we adhere to this day. And so in terms of the comics, what we start to see are, more minority background characters. We start to see a more kind of realistic drawing style for the comics. We start to see more non-superhero comics, and we also start to see, this is when we first see crossovers between the characters and their worlds and things like that. And then moving on to the last age, which is known as the modern or dark age of comics, which started in around the mid 1980s and is still going into the present day. This is when the stories are more darker than ever before. They're a lot more relevant to social issues, and so this is when we see the introduction of characters like the Watchmen, or even the reboot of a character that that we've all known and loved, Batman, turning him into the Dark Knight. This is when we see when we get to become more acclimated with anti-heroes and complex characters and reboots of other characters. This is when crossovers become even more commonplace, and ones that affect the storyline later on. And so now that I've given you a general overview of comic book history, I thought that I would go ahead and talk about, some specific characters and how it is that they specifically relate to society. So the first character that I wanted to talk about is Superman. And so the character of Superman was really popular in the conservative 40s and 50s. And so what you have to remember is at this time, America is still reeling from the Great Depression. And so, they're looking for deliverance from hardship in real world people, so in people like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, but they're also looking for an escape from their world of hardship to one where order was maintained by persons of extraordinary ability who would not allow for the innocent to be harmed. And so in walks this character of Superman that provides the public with that and so much more. Right? Superman, he represents justice, he represents truth, he represents hope, he represents the ideal, the American way. He gave the people something transcendent to believe in. He reminded people, that greatness actually does exist. But what we see with that shift that I talked about that happened in the 70s, it actually kind of really got its start in around the 40s, like during World War II and after. But with the shift, one of the things that happened is that people become a lot more disillusioned with their life and just by the world in general. And the big reason as to why that is because morality becomes a lot more subjective. What people are starting to realize at this time is that there are bad guys on their side, and that there are people on their side that don't necessarily have their best interests at heart. And so, this is when the line between good and bad becomes even more blurred, and it really did lead to a shift in the way that we kind of operate. And so this is why when you look at a character like Superman now, especially the character in the movies, why it is he may appear a lot more dark and gritty, because they're basically just making the character adapt to the times in which he is in. But one character that has always kind of embodied that kind of shift, because he's always kind of been dark and gritty and things like that, is the character of Batman. And so we all know that Batman is a superhero with no real superhero powers. Where he gets his strength is from his exceptional skill and wealth. And Batman is, for all intents and purposes, a vigilante. So for anyone out there that doesn't know what a vigilante is, it is someone that takes things into their own hands regardless of whether, people have actually asked them to or not. And so unlike Superman, Batman didn't really have a moral code that centered around maintaining order and social justice. His whole thing was about fighting crime but not actually killing the villains, because he basically viewed that act of killing them as, him being no better than the actual villains. And, what I've seen is that it led a lot of people to kind of questioning or thinking that Batman, may be an insane hero, because what he's doing never actually solves the problem, right? If his whole thing is about trying to fight crime and stop crime and things like that, when you don't actually kill the villain, it doesn't get rid of the problem. All it's doing is giving them a bit of a break, and then, once they get out of jail or wherever, they just go right back to doing the exact same thing that they were doing. And so, it really kind of lets us know that Batman is a superhero that more or less favors the process more than the actual outcome. And so seeing as though his character has really kind of been popular ever since his creation in 1939, but we do kind of see that shift with his character, thanks in large part to the comics code of authority. So we see that, and so in like the 50s and 60s, we see that he's not as gritty and he's not as dark. He, appears a lot more campy. So think someone like Adam West. I thought that talking about Batman, that I would go ahead and fast forward to the new millennium, where the mainstream public is kind of reintroduced to this character of Batman as the Dark Knight and Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight. And so what you have to remember during this time is that American culture is at a point where they're no longer willing to look up to authorities who advocated playing by the rules and perpetuated the myth that the world was inherently good, because, like I said, really kind of, gaining steam in the 70s because of the Vietnam War and Watergate, and then of course, going to the 80s and seeing the war on drugs. Fast forwarding to the new millennium, right? We have 9/11, we have the war on terror, and in 2008, I think we were, really kind of in the beginning stages of the recession that affected a lot of people's lives. And so the Dark Knight was really like this darker version and more kind of psychologically nuanced depiction of Batman that really did help to fit with the times. And so moving on to another character, Spider-Man. He was, of course, introduced in the 60s. And Spider-Man, for all intents and purposes, is a superhero that made people believe that anyone could be Spider-Man because he was so easy to identify with. And I think that this is one of the things that kind of speaks to the optimism of this time in the 60s, because, you know, people are out there, they're fighting to make a better world for not only themselves, but for, you know, future generations. And so you can basically kind of understand it's people fighting for that chance at the American dream. And so to have this superhero that lets them know that they too can be this if they wanted to, I think, you know, really speaks to, like I said, the optimism of the time. And so, you know, a big reason as to why, like I said, people identified with Spider-Man is because, you know, he struggled and dealt with real life issues, and he really helped to embody the youth culture that was really starting to make their presence known during this time. Moving on to another character, Captain America. As we all know, he was prompted by World War II. He represented patriotism, you know, people that are determined and people that are without limits. And so, you know, the overall societal atmosphere during the time of World War II, you know, it was riddled with, you know, patriotism and people needing to be determined and people needing to get ready to fight, because by 1941, and I think they said that Captain America was introduced in the comics in like March of 1941, right? It's becoming more and more apparent to the American public that maintaining this sense of isolationism is moving further and further away from the reality of the situation, right? And they know that sooner or later they're gonna have to get involved in the war. And of course, you know, we see that a couple months later, starting in December 7th of 1941 with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And so then moving on to another character, Iron Man. Now, Iron Man wasn't a superhero that was, you know, really popular when he was introduced in the comics. He didn't really become popular until his movies that came out in like 2006, 2007, around that time. And so, you know, Iron Man is a celebrity that basks in the glow of self-made fame thanks to his involvement in the war on terror. And so, you know, he's a superhero that's selfish. He drowns his insecurities and fears in alcohol. He suffers from anxiety, panic attacks, and even paranoia. And I mean, if that doesn't embody the 2000s to a T, then I don't know what does. I mean, you know, the 2000s, I mean, even still now, you know, we are in the age of the celebrity where, you know, we're able to have someone like Kim Kardashian be, you know, at the top of everyone's list and, you know, have all these articles and things about them. You know, we all about, you know, this kind of self-made fame that's thanks in large part to social media and the internet that allows for people to kind of take, you know, their own careers into their own hands. And then things like mental health is on the you know, it's at the forefront of a lot of conversations today. And so, you know, it really makes sense to me that a character like Iron Man that embodies all of that stuff would be, you know, really popular in a time where all of that stuff is happening along with a bunch of other things. And so that then leads me to the man of the hour, the character or the superhero known as Black Panther. Though technically not the first black superhero, that title belongs to a superhero known as Lion Man, who debuted in the one and only issued all-Negro comics back in 1947, a comic book that was entirely owned and created by black artists and featured nothing but black faces on the pages. Black Panther still makes history in his own way by being, you know, the first African/black superhero protagonist to be accepted by the mainstream. Now, there's your bit of fact, or there's your fact of the day. You know, Black Panther was created in 1966 by Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, and Don McGregor. And Black Panther, or the comic of Black Panther, was the first time that people you know, really saw a superhero. No, it was the first time that people saw a superhero that was strong, intelligent, educated, resourceful, and black. Also, with the world of Black Panther, this also served as a kind of alternate universe where black people could live vicariously through a thriving African country that existed without white interference. And so keep in mind that up until this point, black representation within media, period, relied solely on the reinforcing of stereotypes that we are unfortunately still combating today. So things like incompetency, ignorance, hypersexualization, being a criminal, being okay with the current social standing that regulates them to being a second-class citizen were all stereotypes that were the norm, and depicting those stereotypes was the norm back then. And so, you know, to have a character come in, you know, like the Black Panther, that exists in a world like Wakanda that is unique with its own architecture, fashion, technology, art, etc., it was revolutionary for its time. And I mean, bigger than that fact, this was something that we had never seen before. This was something that was needed and that was extremely timely for the period of its creation. I mean, remember in the 1960s, we had the civil rights movement happening. And so, this was a time that was filled with radical social change that called for a demand to reform some of the most basic tenets of American life. So things like sexuality, gender representation, and even race were at the forefront of the things that were being challenged. And it was the young Americans that were the ones that were at the heart of this movement. More specifically, looking at the fight for racial justice, you had blacks that were attempting to affirm their identity whilst still dealing with the vilification and dehumanization that has plagued them and the generations before them. And so, it was all about the reclaiming and for most the kind of introduction of a new kind of cultural pride that had been stripped of them the minute their ancestors were packed onto those boats. And so for something like Black Panther to come along and all of its African and black and cultural pride, I know was an amazing thing for the people of the time to be able to experience. And so when I see people downplaying the existence of this new Black Panther movie, saying, it's just a movie or he's just a superhero, I think is to not truly understand the importance that art plays in society, where, of course, society affects the art that it is creating, but the art itself also inversely can and often does have an impact on society. I mean, look at, something like Michael Jackson's Thriller and how that led to more black artists being featured on MTV and how, later on it kind of also had this kind of effect where it allowed for us to think or see that black pop artists could be a thing. Look at a film like The Birth of a Nation that was a film that led to the revival of the Ku Klux Klan back in the early 20th century. Look at another film like Philadelphia and how that helped to change the cultural conversation around AIDS at the time in the early 1990s. Look at a book like The Jungle by Upton Sinclair that, among other things, helped to pave the way for the creation of the FDA. Like, do y'all understand? Like, the FDA has to thank in large part a book for its creation. Our food and drugs being safe is thanks in large part to a book. I mean, and it's like, imagine if people had looked at all of those things and, before they came out and they said, well, it's not like it's going to change anything. It's just a book. It's just an album. It's just a movie. They look pretty foolish in retrospect. But, seeing as though we're not really awarded that same kind of insight because, we're living it right now, so we really can't speak on the impact that this movie will have because it hasn't come out yet, right? It comes out this Friday. And, we won't know the actual impact of this movie until, years down the road. And looking at this movie and to quote, I never thought that I would be saying this, BuzzFeed, Black Panther is an expensive, effects-driven superhero movie that is set in a fictional African nation and features a profusion of many of the most acclaimed black actors in Hollywood. It's such a singular event, and it's something that we haven't really seen before, and that's the thing that makes this more than a movie. And so, to my surprise, when I came across last Tuesday the Twitter hashtag What Black Panther Means to Me, that featured tweets like the opportunity to see black women characters with beauty, brains, and biceps, or other tweets like black directors can tell our stories in the highest level with actors that look like me as the heroes, or other tweets like seeing a whole film full of strong, powerful, educated people who look like me not being discriminated against or mocked. It really helped to put things into perspective for me by showing me or telling me that even though we do have, that group of people that wants to downplay this movie in whatever way that they can, that the number of people that actually understand this movie and understand the significance that this movie has or that it can have on society, that they far outweigh those who don't. Instead of focusing on that negative, I was like, I should be focusing on the positive. Now, with that being said, right, I know that this movie won't lead to the end of police brutality. I know that the man that is currently in office will remain in office after this movie gets released. I know that this movie won't get to the root of colorism that is plaguing our community, and I know that racism will still thrive long after its release. But what we have to understand is that this movie, and I'm sure that the comic book and the superhero back in the day never really existed to fix those problems. I mean, if they did, it may have been a byproduct, but that was never their intention. If anything, what this movie and what the comic book and the superhero does is that it reminds us that representation matters. It provides us with a different image of Black life, and it also shows Hollywood that majority Black cast can sell a movie. It also shows us a bunch of other things, but those were just some things that I thought that I would go ahead and list. And so if the 60s was all about building the dream of what we could be, and if the 2000s had us believing that we were actualizing that dream, to now be in 2018 where those same principles that we fought so hard for in the 60s are now being threatened, I do think that it's important that we're given or that we're shown things that remind us of the power of hope, imagery, and Blackness, period. And I mean, if we're able to get all or even some of that from a mere 2-hour and 14-minute superhero movie, then my question to you is, what is the harm in that? And so with that being said, that is the end of today's episode. Please go ahead and, share and retweet this video. I would love for, as many people to see this movie as, humanly possible. I mean, not movie. To see this, well, of course, I want for you guys to see the movie, but to see this episode as humanly possible because, like I said, I did do a lot of research for this episode. I tried to make it informative, insightful, and also opinionated, and I think that, what it is that I said today, was really of value. In terms of next week, I will be here same time, same day, next Tuesday, 12:30 to 1. I'm sure you all know what it is I'm going to be talking about next week. There's really no point in me giving you a hint. I'm going to be talking about Black Panther. Next week's episode is going to be, strictly, relegated to talking about Black Panther. So, hopefully, I enjoy this movie, and hopefully it gives me 30 minutes worth of stuff to talk about. But I mean, even if it doesn't, I'm supposed to be having special guests with me next week, so it'll be really cool to not just have to talk to myself, to have someone to bounce some ideas off of. So definitely make sure that you tune in to next week's show, because like I said, it's going to be all about Black Panther. And so yeah, in terms of today's episode, I hope that you all enjoyed hearing my, but certainly not the only perspective on not just this Black Panther movie, but also on superheroes in general. Tell me, did you learn something new today? Like I said, one of the things that I really wanted to make sure is that you all were able to learn something new, whether it was, learning about the different ages of comic books, or whether it was, looking or understanding that superheroes and society are definitely connected, or, who actually the first Black superhero was. Also, were you one of those people that looked at this movie and that had and maintained that kind of thought that, it's just a movie, it's just a superhero, it's not like he's gonna do anything? If you were, let me know why did you think that, and if you did watch this entire episode, let me know if what I had to say ended up changing your mind or anything like that. Definitely let me know. So comment below this video or in the comment section wherever you're watching this. But yeah, that is the end of today's episode, and I will see you all next week. All right, bye.